The night I slept in my truck, the temperature dropped to 23 degrees. I know because I kept checking my phone, hoping the number would somehow climb if I looked at it enough times. It didn't. I had a wool blanket in the back seat that I'd used for camping trips with my son when he was 12. It still smelled like wood smoke, or maybe I just wanted it to. I pulled it over my shoulders and told myself this was temporary. I told myself a lot of things that night. 3 months before that, I had owned a landscaping company. 22 years. I built it from a single mower and a beat-up trailer I bought off a guy in Pensacola for $800. By the time it ended, I had 31 employees, 6 trucks, contracts with 3 county school districts, and a hospital campus. Then, a burst pipe in our equipment storage took out $30,000 in machinery. The insurance adjuster found a clause I hadn't read carefully enough. My attorney said I had a case. He also said it would take 2 years and cost more than I had. I made payroll for my crew for as long as I could. I sold the trucks one by one. I let people go in the order that hurt least, which meant there was no good order. By October, it was over. My wife had passed 4 years earlier. Breast cancer, stage 4, 11 months from diagnosis to the end. After she was gone, I sold our house in Clearwater because I couldn't sleep in it anymore. I moved into a rental near the job sites. When the company folded, the rental went with it. I had a storage unit, a truck, and about $400. My daughter lived 40 minutes north of Tampa, in a subdivision with a brick mailbox and one of those decorative wagon wheels by the front door that my wife always said looked ridiculous. My son-in-law had picked it out. That should have told me something. I drove over on a Tuesday afternoon. I hadn't called ahead because I was ashamed of what I was going to ask, and I thought if I showed up, it would be harder to say no to my face. I had one suitcase and a toolbox in the bed of the truck. I remember sitting in their driveway for about 10 minutes before I got out. My daughter answered the door. She looked at the suitcase. She looked at me. She said, "Dad," in a voice I hadn't heard from her before. Not angry, not soft, just careful. Like she was choosing each word before she let it out. I told her the situation. I kept it short. I said I needed a place to stay, just for a few months while I figured out my next step. I said I'd help around the house, cover utilities if I found work, whatever they needed. She said she had to talk to her husband. She went inside. I stood on the porch. The door didn't fully close, and I could hear them in the kitchen. I wasn't trying to listen. I couldn't help it. He said, "Absolutely not." She said my name. He said, "Your father made his choices. We have a mortgage. We have Lily's college fund to think about. My granddaughter's name is Lily. She was 8 years old. I had driven 6 hours round trip to be at every one of her birthday parties. My daughter came back to the door. She didn't open it all the way. She stood in the gap and said, 'Ray, this isn't a good time for us.' She called me Ray. She had called me Dad her whole life. I said I understood. I drove back to the parking lot of a Publix on Route 19 and sat there until it got dark. Then I drove to a park and ride off the interstate and put the seat back and pulled the blanket over me and tried to sleep. I was 58 years old. I had coached my daughter's soccer team for 4 seasons. I had paid for her wedding, the whole thing, including the tent rental. Her husband insisted on because he wanted the reception outside in June in Florida. $12,000. I had handed it over because she was happy and he seemed decent, and I thought that was what fathers did. I lay there in the truck listening to cars pass on the highway, and I thought about my wife. She would have known what to do. She always did. I thought she would be so disappointed in our daughter right now, and then I thought, no, she would find a way to understand it, because that was who she was, and I never fully learned how she did that. I fell asleep around 2 in the morning. I don't know how. At 5:30, a knock on my window woke me up. I nearly came out of my skin. I sat up fast and looked out, and there was a man standing beside my truck in a dark suit, no tie, holding a paper coffee cup. He looked about 60, gray at the temples, the kind of face that had been handsome once and had settled into something more serious. I cracked the window. He said, "Are you Walter Hayes?" I said I was. He said his name was Sutton. He said he worked for a man named Leonard Whitfield and that Mr. Prussian. Whitfield had been trying to locate me for several weeks. He said Mr. Whitfield was in hospice care in Sarasota, and that time was short, and Mr. Whitfield had asked him to find me specifically because there was a matter of a will that needed to be addressed before the end. I stared at him. I said, "Leonard Whitfield." He nodded and waited. I hadn't heard that name in over 30 years. Leonard Whitfield had been my father's business partner back in the 80s, a commercial plumbing contractor who had built half the water infrastructure in Pinellas County before he retired. When I was 24 and trying to get my first real job, it was Leonard who had given me a recommendation letter that got me in the door with a property management company. I hadn't done anything to earn it. I'd met him twice at family dinners. He just believed in me for reasons I never fully understood, and he put that in writing, and it changed the direction of my life. I had sent him a Christmas card every year for a decade. Eventually the address stopped working and I lost track of him. I got out of the truck. Seddon drove me to a house on Siesta Key that sat back behind a row of mature oaks and had a view of the bay from the second floor. Leonard was in a hospital bed in what had been the study. He was smaller than I remembered, which I knew wasn't fair to think. It had been 30 years. I was smaller in some ways too. He had an IV in his left arm and an oxygen tube across his upper lip, but his eyes were sharp and he knew me immediately. He said, "You look like your father." I said, "I'll take that." He smiled. It took effort, but he did it. He told me that he had never married. No children. His estate was substantial. He said this plainly, the way people say it when they've had to be plain about things for a long time. He said he had spent the last year thinking about who he wanted his legacy to go to, and he kept coming back to two things: the memory of my father, who had been the most honest man he'd ever done business with, and what he'd heard about my company. I told him about the company. All of it. He listened without interrupting. When I was done, he said, "Where are you staying?" I said I was working on that. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at Sutton, who was standing near the door. He said, "I want to revise the will." Sutton said he'd get the attorney on the phone. What happened over the next 4 hours, I still can't fully explain without it feeling like something I read in a book rather than lived. Leonard's estate included a 12-unit apartment complex in St. Petersburg that he had owned outright for 19 years, a commercial property on the north end of Sarasota that was leased to a medical supply company, a portfolio of municipal bonds, and a brokerage account. His revised will left me the apartment complex and a portion of the bond portfolio. He left the rest to a Veterans Assistance nonprofit in Bradenton. I tried to tell him he didn't have to do this. He said, "I know I don't have to. That's the point." He died 11 days later. I was there. I want to be clear about something. I am not telling this story because of what Leonard left me. I am telling it because of what happened next, and what I chose to do with it, and what that cost me, and what it gave back. The apartment complex in St. Petersburg needed work. 3 of the units had deferred maintenance issues. The property manager Leonard had been using was polite but slow. I moved into one of the vacant units while the estate cleared probate, and I spent my days walking the property and making a list. I was good at this. I had spent 22 years managing physical assets and people. For the first time in months, I felt like myself. Probate took about 4 months. During that time, my daughter called me twice. She said she'd heard from a cousin that something had happened, some inheritance, and she wanted to know if I was okay. I said I was fine. I asked how Lily was. She said Lily was good. We didn't say much else. Her husband called once. He said he'd been thinking about our conversation, which was a strange way to describe what had happened on their porch, and that if I needed anything, I should reach out. He said the door was always open. I said, "That's good to know." I kept my voice even. I had spent a lot of years managing crews, negotiating contracts, dealing with county inspectors who liked to flex their authority over small things. I knew how to keep my voice even. Once the estate was settled, I sat down with a financial advisor in Sarasota named Alan Goss, who had handled some of Leonard's investments. He was careful and precise and didn't oversell anything. He laid out what I had and what it could reasonably do, and we talked about what I wanted the next chapter to look like. I was 59 by then. I wasn't interested in retiring. I was interested in building something again, this time without the leverage and the exposure that had taken the landscaping company down. I started a property management consulting practice out of my unit in St. Pete. Small at first, 2 clients, both referrals from Alan, then 4, then 7. I hired a young woman named Bria who had been trying to get into property management and couldn't get a foot in the door anywhere, and she turned out to be better at the organizational side of it than I was, which meant I could focus on the client relationships and the assessments. Within 18 months, we were managing consulting relationships for 11 residential properties in the Tampa Bay area. My son-in-law, it turned out, worked in commercial real estate. Not development. He was a leasing agent for a firm that represented retail tenants. He had been trying to move into property management for a while, or so I heard through my daughter, who had started calling more regularly once she understood what I was doing. I didn't ask how she knew. Families find out things. He called me on a Sunday morning in February. He had a client, a small strip mall owner in Pinellas Park who was struggling with vacancy and wasn't happy with his current management. He wanted to know if I'd take a meeting. I said I'd think about it. I thought about it for about a week. I thought about standing on their porch with a suitcase. I thought about my daughter standing in the gap of the door saying this wasn't a good time. I thought about Lily, who had her grandfather's nose, my wife always said, and who I hadn't seen in over a year. I called him back and said I'd take the meeting. We sat across from each other in a conference room at my office. We had real office space by then, a suite in a building off Central Avenue. He was nervous. I could see it in the way he held his coffee cup. He made the pitch for his client carefully and professionally. He was good at his job. I had expected him to be mediocre at everything because I needed him to be, but he wasn't. After he was done, I asked him some questions about the property. He answered them well. Then I said, I want to talk about something else for a minute. He put down his coffee cup. I said, when I came to your house, I had $400 and nowhere to go. I'm not saying that to make you feel bad. I'm saying it because I think you should know the full picture of what that night was like for me, so that whatever we decide to do going forward, we're deciding with our eyes open. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I know I handled that wrong. I said, yes. He said, I was scared. We had just refinanced the mortgage and Lily's school tuition had gone up. And I said, I understand all of that. It doesn't change what you did, but I understand it. He nodded. I said, I'll take the Pinellas Park property, and I want you to bring your daughter to see me. Not here, somewhere she can run around. He looked up. I said, Lily and I need to make up for some lost time. We shook hands. He held on a beat longer than was strictly necessary. I'm not going to tell you that everything became easy after that. My relationship with my daughter took another full year to find its footing. There were conversations that went badly before they went well. There were things I said that I had to go back and unsay or at least explain better. There were things she said that I had to sit with and decide whether I was going to hold on to or let go. I let most of it go. Not because I had to, but because I chose to. That's the part people don't tell you. The choice. The holding on is easy. It's the deciding to open your hands that takes everything you've got. Leonard's revised will included a letter, which Sutton gave me after the funeral. I read it at the apartment complex sitting on the steps outside Unit 6 with a cup of coffee, while a mockingbird worked through its whole repertoire in the oak tree at the corner of the lot. He wrote about my father. He wrote about what it had meant to work alongside a man who kept his word, even when it cost him. He wrote about the recommendation letter. He remembered writing it, he said, because my father had asked him to look at me and tell him honestly whether I was worth it. And Leonard had thought about it for 3 days and decided I was. He wrote, the most reliable thing I can tell you about people is this: how they treat you when you have nothing tells you more about them than anything else ever will. I've watched you for 30 years from a distance, Walter, and I've seen the way you've built things and the way you've lost them and the way you've gotten back up. That's enough for me. I hope it's enough for you. I folded the letter and put it in my shirt pocket. The mockingbird hit a high note and held it, and I sat there with my coffee in the morning light and thought that my wife would have loved this. The apartment, the bay 2 miles away, the bird, all of it. She would have said something that made it more than it was, and then she would have laughed at her own observation, and I would have laughed too. I still talk to her sometimes. Not out loud, mostly. Just in the way you notice something beautiful and want someone specific to see it with you. I'm 61 now. The consulting firm has 14 clients. Bria made partner last spring. My daughter and her husband joined us for Thanksgiving, and my son-in-law got down on the floor and built a Lego set with Lily for 2 hours, and it was the most useful thing I've ever watched him do. Lily calls me on Sundays. She always has questions about everything, about how things work, about what I did when I was her age. She wants to know if I was ever scared. I tell her yes. She says, what did you do when you were scared? I say, I kept going. She thinks about that for a second. Then she says, okay, in the way she does, like she's filing it away for later for some future version of herself who will need it. I think she probably will.